Acht Realisten is less an exhibition record than a manifesto disguised as a coffee table book. 64 pages, 50 reproductions, one essay, and underneath that modest format, a quiet argument against the art establishment of its moment. It was assembled by one of its own subjects, which matters. This isn't an outsider's curatorial survey. It's a painter looking back at his own circle and saying we were right to keep painting the visible world. The title does the real work. Vision van het alledaagse, a vision of the everyday, insisting that ordinariness. Kees Andrea painted the way a storyteller talks, never quite finishing one thread before color pulls him toward the next. He moved fluidly between mediums: oil, watercolor, etching, woodcut, woven tapestry design, stained glass, mosaic, and that restlessness shows in the paintings themselves, which are built from layered, almost theatrical scenes rather than single studied moments. A landscape for him is a stage. He populates it with animals and human figures the way a director blocks a scene, often pulling in motifs from his travels: Hungarian markets, Spanish village festivals, later Central American imagery, and folding them into a style that critics kept calling quasi naive without ever meaning it as an insult. There's a deliberate refusal of polish in his brushwork, a wanting to keep the immediacy of a sketch even in a finished canvas. Underneath the brightness sits something more ambivalent. He once said his Spanish landscapes, for all their carnival color, were really about tragedy and abandonment. That tension between gaiety and unease is probably his real subject. Hans Bayens worked as two artists sharing one hand. As a painter, he leaned impressionist, fast, atmospheric, alert to how light falls across a circus tent, an orchestra pit, a hospital ward, a cafe. As a sculptor, he slowed down completely, modeling in clay and casting in bronze with a patience suited to permanence rather than impression. He didn't see these as competing instincts. He moved between them within the same week, sometimes the same subject, sketching a friend in pastel one afternoon, modeling their head in terracotta the next. His sculptural practice had a literary backbone. He read deeply, was friends with writers and publishers, and his bronzes of Multatuli, Gorder, and Nescios Titanches came out of genuine intimacy with the texts, not commissioned homage. He treated portraiture, whether painted or cast, as an act of attention rather than flattery, which is why his sitters, a prime minister, a cabaret performer, a conductor, all get the same unguarded, slightly off-duty quality. Herman Berserik built his paintings around objects that had already lived a little: chipped enamel, old toys, half-empty bottles, dolls past their prime. He had a printmaker's discipline: etching, lithography, wood engraving alongside the painting, and it shows in how tightly his compositions are constructed, almost architectural in their balancing of object against object. But the discipline serves something faintly off-kilter. His still lifes and self-portraits carry a surrealist undertone, an atmosphere that isn't quite ordinary realism. Light falls strangely. Objects seem to be waiting for something. He was also by trade a working illustrator, designing hundreds of pocketbook covers, which trained him in fast, legible composition, a skill that seems to have fed back into the precision of his easel painting. He wrote often about technique itself, treating craft as something worth explaining rather than mystifying. Theo Kurpershoek thought as a colorist first and a subject painter second. Early in his career, he worked by day as a commercial illustrator, and that trade discipline, clarity, immediacy, a designer's eye for arrangement, never fully left his painting. After around 1968, his palette shifted decisively toward the French colorists, Bonnard and Vuillard especially, and his self-portraits and interiors from that period are almost defiantly sunlit, built from broken, vibrating color rather than careful drawing. He didn't only paint, he produced frescoes, mosaics, and reliefs, worked as a typographer and letterer, and spent decades designing book covers, meaning his visual vocabulary was always being cross-trained between the wall, the page, and the canvas. Friends and critics described him as difficult to pin down personally, but artistically unusually versatile, equally serious as painter, designer, calligrapher, and teacher. Harry Abdullah didn't really think of himself as a painter who occasionally did public commissions. Public commission was the practice. He worked in whatever material a building demanded: stained glass for a church, concrete relief for a school facade, ceramic tile for a factory wall. tapestry cartoon for an office lobby. His guiding principle, inherited from his own teacher, was that monumental art should serve the people who use the building, not announce a message over their heads. A deliberately modest, almost anti heroic position for a public artist to take. Even his easel paintings carry that same plainness of ambition: apples, weather, women, nothing more grandiose than that, painted with warmth rather than statement. He moved easily between abstraction and figuration, depending on what the architecture called for, which made him harder to categorize stylistically than the others. But the underlying ethic, usefulness over self expression, never wavered. Hans van Norden approached painting like a man who couldn't stop noticing what was happening in the room: pubs, kitchens, brothels, family scenes. His eye went toward unglamorous human traffic, and critics nicknamed him the narrator because his paintings always seemed to be mid anecdote. That storytelling instinct carried naturally into stage design. For over 20 years, he designed sets and costumes for ballet, opera, and theater, and the same compositional sense that organizes a crowded domestic interior also organizes a stage picture. He sketched constantly and on the move, doing the actual painting later in the studio from memory and notation rather than working directly from a posed scene, which gives his work a slightly reconstructed, recollected quality even when the subject is mundane. Han Wezelaar worked from the body outward: animal, nude, portrait head, with a sculptor's patience for anatomy that never went out of fashion as far as he was concerned, even when the art world decided it had. He trained early under a pupil of Rodin, and then, remarkably, became the very first student of Ossip Zadkine in Paris, absorbing a modern, simplified approach to form before deliberately walking it back toward representational clarity. He worked across bronze, stone, and terracotta, often returning to the same handful of motifs: a seated figure, an animal at rest, refining them over years rather than chasing novelty. Later in life, he reportedly wanted nothing more to do with his own earlier, more modernist work, which says something about how completely he committed to the realist path once he'd chosen it. Nicolaas Wijnberg treated almost any flat or curved surface as fair territory: canvas, theater backdrop, book jacket, church wall, mosaic floor. He was self taught as a painter despite formal training as a lithographer, and that hybrid background shows. His figurative work has a printmaker's sense of line and flattened plane even in oil. Across roughly 150 stage productions, he designed sets, costumes, and posters, meaning his painting vocabulary was constantly being translated into three-dimensional theatrical terms and back again. He illustrated dozens of poetry collections and novels, which kept his draftsmanship lean and economical. No surface ever got more line than it needed. As the compiler of this very catalog, he was, in effect, the one member of the group consciously building its historical record, even while still actively making the work himself.